Hey, greetings everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Global Urbanism Studio workshop heading to Brisbane this week. We're joined this week by James Davidson, architects, and Sam and Britt and Leonore. Did I say that right? Yeah. Or, okay, good. And so this has been kind of a whirlwind, but we're sort of entering into this last phase of the semester that focuses mostly on water. And I think if there are ideas to take from what we've done up to this point, it's that there's really no one-size-fits-all approach to sustainable or resilient design, and that each city has its own context that we should be responding to. So we're going to be introduced to a really interesting series of localized design approaches that fit into regional strategies that hopefully we can connect back out to these global approaches that we've been developing over the semester. This is our last week on land. Next week we'll be in the oceans with Lisa Kim and her Ocean Atlas project. And I think what is great about James and his team here with us today is that we're going to learn about a city that from the readings that he's provided is open and alive. And we'll look at ways of measuring and controlling and guiding our relationship with water. And we'll work through a narrative, sort of narrative and image-based design process over the course of the week. So we're very happy to have you guys here, fitting into our kind of crazy global semester. And we're excited to work with you this week and appreciate your time. We're also joined by Derek Hoferlin, the chair of Urban Design and Landscape Architecture. And with that, I'm going to sort of hand over the Zoom screen to James in your office.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Hopefully you'll have a great week with us. We pride ourselves on appearing like we're chaotic, but actually there's been quite a bit of thought and preparation going into this. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy both the chaos and the preparation. So, I'll be the light relief for the week, so I can imagine you're pretty tired right now. And so, yeah, we'd like this to be very enjoyable for all of us. And so feel free to just connect. We'll be available during our office hours, unfortunately, because of the time zone difference. It's a little bit hard for you guys, but if you're prepared to kind of work late in the evening, then we'll be around most of your sort of day into the evening a little bit. So probably not most of the day actually. It's a weird time zone difference. So I might hand over to Britt to drive this thing because I'm sitting here with a mouse on my lap, and I'm afraid that as we flick through different things, yeah, so I'm just going to hand the mouse over. Yeah, I think we've had a long history with Derek and obviously John Hole, and we've been more recently obviously getting to know Jonathan. We're really super excited about this one because we don't generally get too involved as a practice in a lot of student-based work anymore because we're actually quite busy. Even during these times, we're very lucky in terms of the work we do to be incredibly busy at the moment. So, so we're just getting ready. My background, I grew up in a very small town, about 50,000 people. It's called Rockhampton. It's about 7 hours drive north of Brisbane. Very dry place on the Tropic of Capricorn, so it is subjected every now and then to large cyclones and flooding. And so my childhood was spent, we were all very well aware of, well, in a sense, I don't think we were aware at the time of the changing climate, more so recently. So I've always had an interest in that. The other thing about my hometown was it has a very it has a horrible history of massacres of Aboriginal people, and so the town itself is divided, not dissimilar in a sense to probably a lot of small towns in the US in certain areas, divided them up because of its history. And so when I came to university in Brisbane, I was interested in connecting and understanding a lot more about Aboriginal identity and how it actually is expressed in architecture. And I went to a high school in Rockhampton where there was about 50% Aboriginal kids, and so I have always had an interest in culture and understanding others, I suppose, rather than just assuming that we know best when anybody knows anything really. So I sort of focused a lot of my architectural education towards anthropology, and one of the my mentors in life is a guy called Paul Nemeth. He's an anthropologist and an architect, and so I really quite enjoyed learning from him, and I've worked for him and with him on and off for over 20 years now. That's led to part of our practice work that we're very proud of, and we continue to do that as long as we're actually working for Aboriginal people rather than for some white person who's in authority. So we're very careful about that sort of thing. So I met Sam. Sam came through Emergency Architects, and you'll see that in the lecture a little bit, the history of that, as a 19-year-old student, and I'm pretty sure he's just turned 30. Is that right? Yeah. We can't get rid of him no matter how hard we try, or vice versa, can't get rid of me no matter how hard I try. That was on the basis, and we seem to, in the practice, we're kind of known for this sort of work, where we're interested in not just capital A architecture, and I feel that for me, building culture is so from an anthropological point of view, architectural anthropology and anthropology also, architecture is material culture rather than architecture is its own thing. It's part of a broader kind of set of social and cultural and economic parameters that we have in our world. So, and obviously the environment is a big part of that. I realised doing a lot of the work we were doing with Emergency Architects that we were putting a lot of energy towards things that, in the end, these were overseas projects. We felt that our energies would have been better served locally, mainly because you can get lost in all that, in that world of helping others when you don't really understand the cultural or the social context. And so when the floods happened in Brisbane in 2011, I'm sure if you've done a little bit of research into what we've sent you and reading, then you'll sort of understand the history of where we're at. We decided to switch from working internationally, because prior to that it was Indonesia, Cook Islands, Solomon Islands, doing aid relief work. We switched into working locally with flood relief, and that's kind of where we begin the lecture. The kind of practice, 80% of the work of the practice now is in this sort of area, and a lot of what you'll see is not capital A, big A architecture. That's for us in the practice is we still do that work. The building that we're in is owned by one of our very wealthy clients who has his office next door, and so we only have very few private clients.
Oh, James, we can't hear you anymore.
We're quite proud of where we're heading.
You just cut out for a little bit, but I can hear you again now.
Are we uploading something? Maybe just stop it. We'll sort this out.
Okay, thanks.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I won't rabbit on any further, but we'll just get into it. This is who we are. You won't see Leonore, she's more a recent member of the JDA pack. Each one of these individuals comes from a very different background generally. Martin, you'll see him walking soon, he's from Peru. Leonore's family from Chile. We've got Clive from Myanmar, Burma. Libby from Korea. Arjan obviously from India. And then obviously Britt and Sam and I are local white Australians. We sort of, I don't know, it's like one big family at the moment, and it's been long term. I mean, most people have been here for quite some time, 13 odd years, and Sam now for over 10, whatever. So in a way, we don't try and work long hours. We'd like the idea of having a balance in life. Architecture is not the most important thing for us. Having a decent life with family and friends obviously is. So we all try and help each other out no matter what happens, and that's something that's very, very important to the practice. So anyway, this is our journey. So we prepared this just to explain a little bit about how we've gone about generating a practice of architecture that's slightly different to your standard kind of typical get a job, work with the clients, design it, build it, or detail it and build it, and then it's done. It becomes an object in space. I think I would rather drive a bus than be an architect if I couldn't do it in the way that we're doing it. And mainly because I feel that the world needs good ideas, more so even now, more than ever, and it needs good people who are committed to following through and know how to actually advocate for an idea and then put things into action. I made a decision very early on in the practice. I wasn't interested in doing what we call development applications for developers. We don't really work with developers in our practice work. That's primarily because I used to be in development and I saw how we played the game with architects, and architects were always well and truly more than happy to be abused for the sake of getting the job and creating an object. And I thought that wasn't what I was interested in architecture to do. So basically we started, and this is only from the flood event, we started in 2011. My sister prior to the 2011 floods had, in 2009, lost her house in Kinglake, which is in Victoria in the south. There were some big fires that went through there. So I saw the impact on that community at the time of who had insurance and who didn't have insurance in a bushfire context. So when the floods in Brisbane occurred, we rallied around and started with Emergency Architects. I was a director of that at the time. We decided to essentially work with uninsured people in some of the worst affected areas. And Sam and about 3 other young people at the time worked tirelessly to run a program where we had 60 architects and 100 students. And we teamed up an architect with 2 students, and they were going from house to house offering essentially what is now called a Build Back Better service. So out of that, we learned a lot about flooding and how to be more flood resilient. So it seemed to me to be a good opportunity to jump into this kind of area because nobody else was doing it, and everybody was pointing the finger at each other as to who was to blame, and the local newspapers were pointing the finger at the various councils, and the councils were pointing the local authorities. They were pointing a finger at the state government, and the state government was pointing a finger at the federal government, and while everybody's pointing a finger, people are still actually badly affected. So that's primarily what's that's Martin, by the way. He keeps the practice running while we all have fun. Yeah. So basically, there was a lot of blame happening, and I just can't stand that. I hate that kind of action, and I'd much rather just get in and try and roll our sleeves up and help. So at the time, we learned a lot about what didn't work in a flood context, which we then started being known for being interested in this area, and we were fortunate enough to be invited to do a range of different private projects, and because there was quite a bit of insurance money floating around at the time as well. So we started putting what we were learning doing the flood relief work that took about 6 months into practice. Then you can see there that I basically was fortunate enough at the time. I wrote a fellowship application for Winston Churchill Fellowship, which is it's a UK Australia sort of relationship in a sense. From it was an endowment from Winston Churchill back in the day for Australians to travel the world. Basically, it's quite a prestigious award, and it was the reason that I now know Derek, because out of that work, I became friends with Spade and Schlabers and Stein over at Bosch Schlabers in the Netherlands, and that's how I met John and Derek. And then we put together a project. I think it was in 2014. Was it? I can't remember. 2014. 2014. Yeah, in Rotterdam together. That then went into a bit of a hiatus after that project. It was about flooding in Brisbane, but we always had the idea that we would try and get together in Brisbane and do something big. Which then turned into what we had as a set effect. One of the defining moments of the practice over the last 10 years was the production of water futures. And Derek and John were incredibly important in that. While we had all the kind of local connections, Derek and John and the Bosch Schlabers crew actually brought to Brisbane international understanding and kind of essentially, yeah, they basically helped us understand what was happening at our local context in a broader kind of vision of what was going on essentially for the Mississippi and also what was happening in the Netherlands. So after that, we collated everything that we did with the Water Futures project and the charrette that was run, and we essentially created this book, which has, I think there's been about 500 distributed over the last few years, and into all different types of circles, and it's been very well received. A lot of people have often talked to me about it, and I'm quite surprised at where it's ended up in a sense. So that then led to a range of different things. One was a student workshop and studio that we did, which then got the attention of the local council, local authority. That then essentially led into us being, it kind of raised our profile to the point where we were then asked to work on the flood resilient homes program for the Brisbane City Council. So, and that's something that you'll see as we keep going through. But essentially, I'll just keep moving forward. But before we do, so we've gone from an event into an action, into some research, collaboration, advocacy, back to action, into policy, and then action again. So we can't do anything in this office if it doesn't lead to some form of action. I can't stand just wasting my life energy on things that are not going to lead to change or to have an impact on something. So this is kind of almost like a roadmap for this week, I feel, in the sense that we are going to be asking you things like, okay, what's your response? What's your idea? Let's do some research into that, which I'm sure you've already done if you've spent the semester already working up an idea for the various studios. We then collaborate, and then we'll ask you, okay, well, how could you see yourself advocating for a position in this? And what are the kind of areas that you would potentially consider? So, because my thinking is that architects are really quite bad at communication. We don't learn enough of it. We don't learn generally how do you advocate for an idea. Typically, it falls to, say, extroverted people to just keep talking, like me right now.
Can I just ask a super quick question? Are there slides that are supposed to be advancing?
No, we can go through it now. I'm just giving the overall.
Sorry, I didn't know you had mentioned something about a roadmap. I didn't know if there was a.
This one's important, but then we can skip through the rest.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so basically the idea that what we would like to bring to the studio is create your idea, come up with an idea, but then actually let's roadmap it out in terms of what it could actually and how you can actually go about carrying this forward. So anyway, I'll shut up and do you guys want to jump in now? Yeah, this one.
Sure.
Yeah.
We put this slide in. This studio won't just be about flood resilience, but I think it's important to, I won't actually explain it there, you can read it for yourself, but just to think about what resilience actually means and your interpretation of it. For us, it's really the ability to prepare, live for, and then return to a normal household routine. So thinking about the pre and post life that you'd have after the disaster. In the floods, a lot of people were really screwed, basically, afterwards, financially. You can imagine a single mum having a mortgage and then having the house completely destroyed. That's not a good place to be in, but yeah, keep going. But we wanted to introduce you to the floods and to Brisbane. So the best way to do that is to actually show a video. Can you? Oh yeah, okay. How do I do that, Britt?
So stop the share.
Mm-hmm.
Just go desktop one.
Yep.
Yeah, go share bottom right.
Mm-hmm.
And then go video.
There's the video.
Go to find out.
So
There should be that maybe.
yeah, got it. So that shut down. How come that's converting now?
While we're doing waiting for
Yeah,
that,
let's.
but we anyway. We'll just keep going through the thing, and when it pops up, we'll. Can you just put that up for the screen? Thank you. So this is my hometown of Rockhampton. Now, one of the interesting things about Rockhampton is, given that it actually floods regularly, everyone there is. I literally grew up in a town where flooding is not seen as a disaster. It's actually well and truly understood. Our houses are all generally raised up above the line, even though that's now the line is moving higher and higher as with the effects of climate change. Just keep going. That's generally what happens in a flooding event. So it's not seen as a, whereas this is Brisbane, where over time the population growth and development, people are built in underneath and in the floodplain. So it's something that is a problem and we work with on a daily basis. This will be in the briefing document that we send around. It just gives you an idea of, interestingly, we are moving away from the terminology of drought to a terminology of dry. So drought, there's a sort of a connotation of drought as being a woe is me, where there's, the world is ending. Whereas dry, more sort of, is a more appropriate terminology for reflecting the fact that Australia's history has been high periods of rainfall, but then also high periods of dry, essentially. Doesn't mean that it's desert. Anyway, just keep going. This is just how we went through with emergency architects. And that was kind of what it looked like at the time. So you can see the duct there with a student working with a homeowner that's obviously living in a house that's been flooded, where he's lost pretty much everything. Is it? Well, is it actually converted? This is sort of what we've seen, and one of the houses that we ended up fixing up for these clients is what it looked like, and that's essentially how we learned what didn't work, basically. So let me just check the video.
Actually, so if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we did is in our advocacy and helping people actually treat it as a research exercise. So we just included the checklist there, but we basically went through every part of the building to ask what did and didn't do well with flood. But let's just go back to the video and see if it's there now. Yeah, great. All right.
Flood.
I want us to remember who we are. We are Queenslanders. How's everyone going to survive?
Residents right along the coast are being urged to prepare. Midnight, the start of a new year. Spirits were high in Brisbane. So were floodwaters across a vast area of Queensland. In Emerald, 1,000 homes were underwater.
This is an urgent message.
Theodore had been emptied. The first time in Queensland history, an entire town was evacuated by helicopter. Condamine was the second. Chinchilla had already flooded. So too Dalby. And Warwick. And Bundaberg. Residents in the city of Rockhampton were hit. Maryborough was next. Then the town of St George. And the main street of Gympie. And Oakey. Chaos stayed. 7 communities flooded or isolated. Some towns repeatedly.
This is the fourth one we've had in the matter of 3 weeks. We had a big one, a medium one, then a big one, and then another one's coming again.
We have to pack it up, put anything up on higher ground.
And then the deluge began across the southeast. And a brown, murky mass started moving. The dams quickly filled up, but Ivanhoe could take it. At least that's what many assumed.
It was a triple whammy of extreme weather events that combined to create the flood of 2011. Problem number one was the huge volume of water flowing into Ivanhoe Dam. Now, because its flood storage compartment filled rapidly, that water was released and began making its way to the city. Problem number two, the Deadly Torrent coming down Lockyer Creek, the highest on record, and it travelled faster than previously seen, towards the Brisbane River, where it enters just below Ivanhoe Dam. And on top of that, problem number three, another 300 millimetres of rain falling right across the region. Making matters worse, factor in the extra water flowing down the Bremer River and flooding Ipswich. And that's why Brisbane's flood was much deeper and happened more suddenly than anybody thought possible.
Brisbane, the river city, again a city in the river. Australia's third largest city inundated.
Well, I think this is probably the first time in Australia's history where we've ever had one of our largest cities actually be paralysed completely for nearly a week.
77 Brisbane suburbs were impacted by floodwater. 32,000 homes and businesses affected at the peak. The nightmare of 1974 had returned. Homes vanished underwater.
Devastating for the people affected, hugely costly. This is probably our most damaging flood since or flood period since European settlement.
The 1974 flood hit on a long weekend with many more people away. The warnings to residents back then meant nothing to people in the suburbs. This time, council used technology to get information out. In 1974, the Weather Bureau relied on people to phone in Greek hunts. Now, those readings are automated. But what has changed dramatically? The amount of development on the floodplain. Take Rosalie as an example.
This is where we'll be working.
In 1974, there was a butcher shop and strip of businesses. Now, the butcher shop is a deli, surrounded by an entire dining precinct. Across Ipswich and Brisbane, more businesses and homes in the flood zone.
It's been enormous. It's just unbelievable, the amount of development. With houses still being built, obviously, in floodplain areas. The stuff that had to be pulled out of the houses and dumped was identical to 1974.
Okay, so yeah, we'll just go to the next slide. So basically, as we were helping people understand, the idea of the program is to help people understand how to build back better, as I mentioned. I'll just keep going. So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, we started to learn about what didn't work. So traditional kind of Queensland homes worked very, very well, and that's on the left there. They're typically a lot of just lightweight timber frame construction with no cavity walls, because obviously we tend to swing between very hot periods and not so hot periods. We won't say cold, because you guys know cold better than we do, versus sort of the more so conventional houses of today, which are very much development driven, cheap to build, concrete slab on ground, and then pine frame construction with plasterboard, like jib board, is it that I call it over there? Okay, anyway, one of the nice things about our traditional kind of homes, and you'll see a lot of this in Rosalie, which is part of why we've chosen Rosalie, because it's easy to kind of move these homes. And it happens regularly. We've done it a lot ourselves. You can raise them, you can chop them up. That is the beauty of having a lightweight structure. Timber is also a very forgiving structure. It's very forgiving material, sorry. So it means that once you do make a move, you don't have to kind of think too hard about it. So this is a house we did, one of our first private practice projects. And you can sort of see where the floodline there, where we started and where we ended up. So we'll just kind of quickly flip through this. Again, we had to shift and raise the home, but the kind of principle behind flood resistant design we started to develop, whereby the lower ground floor, which is always going to be prone to flooding, is easily washed out. There's essentially 2 doors in each room for easy cleaning. Just keep going. And that's essentially what it looks like. So we tried our best to not use cavities in the wall materials and the wall systems. All the cabinetry that you can see there, the kitchen especially, and other elements of the house can be pulled out. We had to design our way around, well, how can you remove the carcass, which is essentially holding up the bench top, which effectively is the most expensive, well, one of the most expensive components of a kitchen, for instance. So we worked very hard with the guys that actually construct these things to learn to work out ways of doing this more appropriately. Keep
Keep going. Another house we did. We started to refine our details a little bit more, and work out things like fencing. How do you actually create a fence that allows water to flow through, while maintaining a certain degree of privacy, for instance. This was one of our main. This house here was the first one we started with, but the one that kind of led to a lot of learnings. And you can kind of sort of see we ended up having to raise this by a few meters, so 10 feet or so. We went from where you see on the left to where you see on the right, so that you didn't sort of have a really serious. Just go back to the last one. Yeah. The problem is we learned a lot about when you start raising homes, not only does the floodline change as time goes on, but the higher you get out of the ground, the more sort of divorced you are from your backyard. And that's the detached kind of dwelling, and the relationship to the backyard is something that we in our area, part of the world, hold very dear. And a lot of people like their backyards, and they, back decks and backyards, and it's a safe place for kids to play, etc. So we ended up trying to raise an area of the backyard up at the same time as raising the house up, so that the scale between the house and its backyard didn't change as dramatically as it could have. So keep going. So this is the sort of the process of what we went through. Yeah, thank you. We started with what you saw before, and we ended up with using materials that essentially could work well in high water and sort of inundation events. So hardwood timbers, marine ply that they use in boats. Essentially something that could effectively last 4 to 5 days submerged. Again, the kitchen in that previous image is designed to pull out and put upstairs prior to an event. One of the things that we noticed, and this is where we started kind of understanding, well, architects, we generally kind of are tasked with solving problems that occur because there's been bad ideas that have followed through in terms of land use planning. And one of the things that we're kind of thinking about with the Rosalie project is how, if we had an opportunity to do it better, how would we do it better? And that's where you guys come in. But this is where it all began. So basically you can see there that each property in Brisbane gets what they call a floodwise property report, and it gives you, this is meters AHD, so Australian height datum, which is effectively roughly around high tide level. So if you think that high tide level is some areas between 0 and 3 feet or something like that, then from here you basically multiply by 3 every one of those, all the numbers there. So minimum habitable floor level of 8.5 meters is about 25, 26 feet, let's say, for this property. But you can see there the ground levels on the side are significantly lower. Just keep going, Britt. So we started, well, Sam can explain this one. Yeah.
One of the things that we were looking at is I was writing this, we did this in 2014 or 15, James, and I was writing my thesis on this house. And then we went back and looked at the building approval that we did in 2011. And when James is talking about those datums, one of the things to keep in mind is that they're wrong. It's actually that you can never quite trust them, and we'll show you why. When we flooded, that's what the house was, and that was the datum that the government set. Then we renovated the house to have the upper floor to actually be what we thought was safe and comply with the codes. Made the lower floor work with flood. Next one. When we went back, the government had revised the datum up 1.2 meters, so that's 4 feet that it went up. Click to the next one. So then the upper level of the house was also effectively uninhabitable per the government standards to code. You go to the next one, Britt. Then the neighbour built the house next door, to actually comply with that. And then if you go to the next one, and that's what it was looking like at the time. So it's insane to like just take these datums as a given. We as architects have to think about how we can work with these lines better, but also have some influence on how we actually have a conversation with the government about how this actually impacts our cities. So if we go to the next one.
One thing that is very much different from between here and the US is you guys believe a lot in levies. And that's something that obviously you've got your Army Corps of Engineers that sort of manage all of that a lot of the time. The thinking in Australia is they're expensive to do and they don't necessarily work. And a lot of the time, from our experience in many areas, once the water gets in behind a levee, you struggle to get it out. So there's a lot of discussion and a lot of communities around Australia have had bad experiences with levees. And so the more broader thinking now is, what are the other ways we could actually do protect our cities? And flood resilience is one of those. We're currently working in Melbourne, we've done the flood resilience guide there. The Gold Coast, on the coast down near Brisbane here, which is a tourist sort of mecca. We've done the flood resilience guide there. Anyway, you'll see that. This is where you'll see in that bottom image, bottom right hand side, you'll see Derek with his back turned to us in the far back there. You'll see John at the front table. It was a very good event for Water Futures, and yeah, so we'll just keep going.
I think the main reason why we did this was to actually address the faults upstream in terms of we were working at one end of the spectrum in terms of policy, but we actually realised that we also had to change the policy itself. We couldn't just
So that's
Legislative problem.
and that's sort of something that in the beginning, as I was rabbiting on about how do you go from just being an architect that is tasked with solving problems that could have been resolved better in other ways, and how do you actually then use your skill, your communication skills, your research skills, your advocacy skills to generate have an impact back into policy. And that's something that we've done very well. It's not something that was necessarily deliberately planned, but in a way it was naively deliberate, let's say. And this is one of the ways we managed to do that, because of this charrette, 5 days it went, and we were able to bring a lot of very important people. To be honest, I just invited so many people, I didn't realise who we were actually bringing, but it worked out very well. So just, next one. That's the book. Yeah, we'll just keep flicking through this one. Basically, one of the things that John and Derek brought to an understanding for us was how the system, the watershed system across our lower southeast corner of our state works. And you can sort of see there, that's a sort of a geographical distribution of essentially some of the most important components. So there were, what we worked out essentially were 5 kind of components to it, all working hand in hand and influencing each other, from the Wivenhoe Dam through Lockyer Valley to the Bremer and Ipswich area, into Brisbane and then out to Moreton Bay. Now each of those areas is incredibly important and linked. So we will be, as you've probably seen in the early work, that if you've read the stuff about Rosalie already, we're taking this kind of approach and doing it at a much smaller scale for a smaller watershed in Rosalie. I'll just keep going through. We've got 10 more minutes. Yeah. So as I mentioned, these are the sorts of publications that we've done, and some of them are about to be released. So we started first off with Maitland in New South Wales, where we were asked to look at the implications of flood resilience with heritage buildings. That's on the left-hand side there. So we essentially did a lot of work in that town on understanding, well, what are the heritage kind of components to the town that are important and how they work with flooding. That then led to doing the flood resilience guide for Queensland. That's our state. I think Queensland, in terms of the size, what would it be in terms of the size for the US?
Queensland's Texas.
Texas, okay. So something like the size of Texas, that's sort of been a very valuable document that's now having an impact on a broad range of policy decisions. It's a guide, mainly it's not policy yet, but that's the intention. There's a bit of a process to go through from being a guide into policy, but it has a policy impact already. As I mentioned, Gold Coast Flood Resilience Guide in Melbourne, and then more recently, given our interest in these areas, we have gotten involved in bushfire resilience as well with the CSIRO, and that's quite exciting because we've always had an idea of heading into other elements of climate change adaptation. What's not on this image actually, now that I think about it, is we've done storm surge for the state government as well, and also we've helped with the cyclone guide as well. So we're getting known around, well, in these parts anyway, for being architects that are interested in this area, which there aren't too many of them, to be honest, because it's not sexy work. One of the more recent houses that we've done, which kind of combines all of our thinking of flood resilience. Just keep going. We were essentially working on the lower level of this house. Again, we're putting into practice a lot of our sort of thinking on flood resilient design. We use a geopolymer concrete slab because we're committed to sustainability in the sense that if we could find ways of doing things affordably, then we should. So a geopolymer concrete slab uses waste from the mining industry. It actually absorbs CO2 as it ages. So that's something that we're very proud of. This is the first house in Australia that used a polished geopolymer slab. The idea of polishing sent the chemists at this concrete company kind of, they scuttled around worrying about cracking, but it didn't in the end. So let's keep going. And this is kind of what it looks like at the end of the day. So just keep moving. One of the most important things about advocation is basing it on facts. Now, this whole kind of, you can't just sort of as an architect say, oh, I feel like this is a good idea, or without having some basis in why. So we often bring economists into our projects. This was the one that we did for the flood guide, but it just gives us a basis in creating, and it's something that I learned from the Dutch as well, the cost benefit associated with an idea. So this is one of the main ways we've been able to kind of advocate for good ideas. It's using science to our advantage. So anybody who's kind of thinking about doing an infrastructure project, large scale in Australia, needs to have a cost benefit ratio of about 1.5. That means for every dollar spent, there's a $1.5 return. The project that we're going to be showing you now has a cost benefit, an actual cost benefit, now that we're building, of 8.9. So that's for every dollar spent, it's $8.90 return, which kind of blows everything out of the water, which means that the local council has just given us an extra 2-year extension on the program. So anyway, we'll just keep going through. Oh.
This is my place.
Looks like Britt's the comic relief on this one. Okay.
So how do you advocate for change? You know, it's the things that we've been talking about. It's about building a case, it's about considering economics, and you know, who are the key parties that you need to influence to make change happen. A few of the ones that a few of the parties we've addressed in some of those documents are local government, state government, insurance companies, statutory authorities. We've spoken to catchment associations, and we've done a lot of work in public engagement. We've also educated and worked with builders, suppliers of products like in the Chelmer House and general community as well.
One very important component to climate change adaptation in our country, because like you, we have a federal government that makes things very difficult in that sense to make change. But the insurers are essentially the biggest influences in this area. So we worked hard at cozying up and explaining to them why it was important to consider it. And that's where the cost-benefit work came in. Surprisingly, they jumped on board very quickly. So our houses have received, just keep going. The houses that we do, our clients get a 50% reduction on their insurance premiums, which is very substantial, and that helps a lot. Unlike the US, our insurance is not linked into a nationalised system. Our flood insurance, it's actually, so therefore it's not tied to our mortgages and things like that. So it's a lot easier for people to kind of get insurance flooding. And you can explain this pretty flat.
This is just going back to the Melbourne Flood Resilience Guide. So this was an interesting exercise for us to take our learnings from our local state of Queensland and translate them into a different climate and different context down in Victoria and Melbourne. So this is just looking at denser, older terrace house dwellings and how we let the water flow through in a very densely populated city.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about Melbourne is, compared to Brisbane, the topography in Brisbane is very hilly and a lot of valleys and a lot of flash flooding, whereas in Melbourne it's incredibly flat and not too dissimilar, I suppose, to New Orleans, perhaps. I don't know St. Louis, so the principles are the same, but we've had to learn a different typology of housing and how to sort of adapt our principles to that. So
this is just a sort of resource for you guys as well, looking at how we wet-proof and dry-proof structures and considering electrical services and how you use your garden as well as a way of mitigating or lessening the effects of flood events. And this is a table of non-resilient and flood-resilient materials as well.
This is a program we're incredibly proud to be involved with. A couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we were approached to get into essentially create this program and then manage it. On our books currently, we have a list of 890 properties to do over 4 to 5 years. Not all of those properties are going to be eligible for works, but to date, I think we've done about 225 assessments and built, what was the numbers?
225.
75 projects completed. And we've just had that extended by another 2 years. So that's a good thing. Just keep going. Basically, just keep looking through. These are some of the kinds of ways where actually we designed this little thing called a flood hub. The previous image you saw was a virtual flood hub, essentially, which explains to people in certain communities where we're going what the ideas of flood resilient design are. So this is another one of those kind of community awareness raising advocacy activities that we get involved with. That when I say we get involved with, we gave the council the idea for this. So we're not passive participants in anything, we're very active. I've found that a lot of local government authorities, as long as you can inspire them with good ideas and they believe you, then you can pretty much get away with a lot of things. And that is, you know, why don't we create something like a little tiny home that then actually kind of talks about flood resilient design. And then this thing gets, you know, towed around on the back of the truck, behind the truck, essentially to a whole range of different areas in Brisbane. This is Rosalie. Now, the reason we chose Rosalie was because of this program. So the Rosalie Futures is a recognition that it's an area of inner city Brisbane that's under quite a lot of population pressure. and over the next 50 odd years, it will be an area that comes under increased scrutiny. But it's also a highly flood-prone land, and not just riverine flooding, but also flash flooding from sort of high rainfall events.
On this map, the properties shown in red are flood-affected houses.
Yep. So the council gave us that. This is one of the maps that Leonore's been working on, which essentially shows those properties and the kind of flood-prone area that we've chosen for Rosalie Futures. This is a residence report that we essentially give to the homeowner. One of the critical components of this is awareness raising, and that's been, quite a valuable, from a council point of view, local authority, because a lot of the time they're dealing with quite angry people when somebody's brought into a property and then all of a sudden they're getting a metre of water, 3 feet of water through their ground level.
And the way we produce this is we actually go in and talk to the homeowner. We laser scan their property and talk to them about different flood resilience strategies that could help reduce their anxiety if there was to be another flood event in the future.
Interestingly, we always track everything. So we give a pre-service survey and a post-service survey. So you can see there that there's a significant drop in levels of concern once we've been through a property. Yeah, just keep going. Just some general kind of comments. We work very hard. James likes to talk. And just some images of, happy homeowners, essentially. We've had over 90% success or excellent rating on the program, which is kind of unheard of. And I think it's because we empathise a lot with people, and also we have practical kind of solutions for them. So that's something that, so I might hand over to Leonore, because she's done a lot of this work. Yeah, just to explain what's going on.
Starting with some images of the flooding in Rosalie to set the scene, getting an idea of what kind of buildings and landscape we're dealing with, and we can flip
This is Rosalie.
Yeah, that's the town centre, right at the very low point of the suburb.
So it's 2011 these images.
Yeah. Damage, and then now we're kind of flying over. This is the lowest part of the catchment. You see a lot of industrial big block buildings and the train line in the foreground.
Sort of river there at the top.
Yeah.
So just show the canal there. So there's a sort of this is the constriction point for us, because Rosalie is actually to the left, coming down the hill towards the river there. So the train line you can see is a major restriction point. There's a canal on the bottom there as well, down this.
Yeah.
So you can see that obviously used to be a creek system, and it's just been, essentially what a lot of people have done elsewhere around the world. We've just narrowed it, filled it full of concrete, turned what was once a beautiful creek into a canal.
Which you can read about in your readings list in a webpage called There Once Was a Creek. That kind of
that's a good one. Yeah.
History and the background of what was there.
This is just further up. You can see the train line in the distance on the right-hand side, and through Park. So the creek would have run all the way through here at some point in the past. But now it's just been filled and put car parks down there with a playground for kids. Milton State School on the left. That's another seriously important kind of area for the plan. Just keep going.
And we'll point this out in the map, and it essentially forms a chain of open space where the majority of the water flows through.
Different angle of the same state school, which is here. Gregory Park used to actually be called a swamp and was the end of that river we were speaking about.
So this is the Rosalie kind of commercial area.
A lot of those images that you saw before of the town centre were taken around this corner. Further up in the catchment, this is more sort of timber and tin detached houses.
just giving you an idea. So basically you see here that the typology of housing is very much detached, timber frame construction, very lightweight, easy to remove, with green backyards. Very, as I said earlier, everyone's very proud of their backyard. Okay.
And here we have the catchment itself. So the outer edge shape that you see is delineated by the highest point of the whole catchment, essentially following a ridge line. And the topography can be described as a series of rings that goes lower and lower as you reach the overland flow, which is the very branchy looking creeks joining down the middle. The yellow is residential housing, which you can see makes up the majority of the area, with little bits of orange from apartments, and then the red is commercial related buildings. The black ones tend to be they're public buildings, a lot of schools, and you have Government House, which is quite prominent in the middle there, like biggest green space. And the overland flow, you follow it and it meets the riverine flooding, which creeps down from the bottom right, which is the Brisbane River, and squeezing past the train line, which forms this phenomenal black wash as the water gets caught and overland and riverine meet right where the parks, the chain parks are that we were describing.
At the end of last year, we used Rosalie again because we know a lot about it for a small day-long charrette. We started to do a similar exercise to water features, where we wanted to understand how the system of pluvial or overland water flooding works within this catchment. This was a rough map that I drew describing slowing the flow in sort of the top of the catchment in the higher ground, blue-green streets, using your small residential streets to absorb water, and then in the lower areas that we were describing for adapting the neighbourhood and potential future uses, which we'll talk more about later. This is what sort of informed the framework that Leonore will talk about.
So keeping that map in mind, now we start to translate it into a Transect methodology, which is essentially linear systems that relate to each other. So you can't break down an individual site without looking at the catchment as a whole and how it functions, and how all stages of it affect each other.
And this one specifically dealt with the idea of growth. So Rosalie has a population projected to double by 2050 in that catchment somehow. So it put the constraint on about where would people live and how do you produce density in a way that's safe, but also brings amenity to the lower lying areas. So you'll see in each of those 5 sections, there's an idea about slowing the flow upstream for overland flow, working with the existing residential fabric, the traditional character Queenslanders, and then moving down to developing more urban ideas about how you live with water and the river. And it's the same logic that, and you guys can read more into these, but
we see this. We see what's happening in Rosalie as a direct. It's yet another component of sponge urbanism there, and so basically, what do you do in an area of high population growth when you have climate change impacts, and now we've got COVID impacts? So what we're hoping is, sorry, just keep going. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through, but this is another project that we did for one of the kind of urban utilities organisations here, authorities in Brisbane, where we looked at a whole range of different waste to energy generation. So we've put this in here because we feel that Rosalie, with a population at the moment of about 25,000, in the future it'll be 50, obviously very small scale when you compare to other areas of the world. but how do you go from using waste systems to generate energy and therefore reduce our sort of reliance on fossil fuels? So we want to throw that at you as well. So it's a little bit of a diagram that we created on this other project that we thought could be very useful when considering what you guys are doing.
It's also said you're taking a problem and making it into an opportunity, or understanding how it could be an opportunity. So I guess if you had a look at the task sheet, you would have already started to see the first, or one of the first tasks, but what we're asking you to do is look at flooding within this area, which we've already talked about a lot, and then densification in Rosalie, and then look at a system or a condition or an idea that you're interested in or that you've been exploring over the past few weeks, and then combine them together and examine how these three systems or conditions exist on your site, and then use those and map their relationship in a transect diagram, which is similar to the one we showed you before in Rosalie, and then consider how these systems could inform a built response on the site.
What we're kind of hoping is we can piggyback on the work you've already done this semester. We'll provide you with all the understanding of flooding in the area, so that way you don't have to think you're not going to have to go off and do a whole bunch of research. Hopefully our expectation and our hope for this week will be this is quite an enjoyable process, because and it's not an onerous process. So the minute you feel that it is, just get in touch with us, and we'll make sure that we're available, one of us or two of us, the whole week. I'll be flying in and flying out, coming in and coming out, and we've got various meetings, but generally there will be somebody, if not more than one person, available to talk. So, okay. Leonore, you might want to explain?
Yeah, and then back to applying the design approach from the charrette back on the mapping exercise. And it's important to study an overall approach as you zoom into the tiles that you can see if you focus in this drawing. They're a bit light, but that gives you an idea of the scale that you'll be working with in relation to the whole area that affects it. And
so just go back to that last one, sorry. So the idea is that you choose a tile as a pair, and that tile is the same scale as what they've been working on previously, is that right?
It's similar. It's sort of a block scale. So
yeah. Is everyone still working as a pair? In pairs? We chose 16 tiles anyway, just in case you don't. But it'd be preferable, obviously, to work in pairs on this. So you guys can sort out which tile you want to work on, and we can help you with that. Also, if you need on the ground help, just call out, and if you want to know something more specific about a particular area, somebody here could go on it. Take some photos, or we've got a drone that costs a lot of money, so I wouldn't mind using it if you're interested in that. We've got to be a bit careful. We can't fly it over homes and stuff. We can fly it over public open space as long as we've got 30 meters or something. Anyway, yeah. Sorry.
And one last thing about the way the tiles were selected. You notice there's a lot of shared boundaries between them. And we encourage communication and coordination between neighbouring strategies so that you're not doing counterproductive things. And this is the meetings on we have in 2 days will be an opportunity to hear what other people are planning, and keeping in the back of your mind that everything has to work together as one system.
We'd like that. That way you're not just working in isolation. You're also working with everybody, your neighbours. No matter how difficult that may be, I think it's an important part of what we'd like you to do. So, yeah.
This precedes the example of the scale of Swivel Transect that we'll be looking at, but it's just kind of giving the concept of, let's say the top section is cut from one end of the tile to the next, then you choose an area of interest and zoom in, and if we go to the next slide, this just a bit more analysis of what the transect starts to look like.
Yeah, so I guess all we're asking you to do is to just think about how the three systems that you've identified, so the flood, your system, and the densification, and show how it works on your tile. So we just suggest taking a section through the tile and then start working out how the different relationships on the topography work with flood, and then apply the other two from there.
And I'm pretty sure the Rhino model, Leonore set up a Rhino model for you, so that's available as well. So you'll be able to cut your sections through that. So, yeah, excellent. Just now, what I'd love to occur at the end of all of this is some imagery, whether that's just a series of small images that explain your idea about those three how those three things connect. So your interest from the semester, because we're hoping that you've pretty much defined it by now, and hopefully it'd be nice to kind of use what you've done previously and overlay that perhaps on our context, and then that will generate a pretty interesting discussion, I think. So your interest, the densification and the flooding. So, because we will use your work as to help us advocate for a better kind of approach for Rosalie in the future, and we'll give you full credit. We'll give you options to get involved in all of that, because that's basically how we've worked and how we continue to work. So it's just your work will become an important part of potentially changing the future of Rosalie. And even if it's just to confuse, totally happy with that. And because we like disruption, that's kind of where we sit in what we do a lot of the time, is we focus on how can we disrupt a thought process, which is what they call BAU, business as usual. And one of the ways we do that is through imagery and through visualization. So hopefully you can help us with that.
And then rather than producing a detailed design of a building, we're actually asking you to use these vignettes as the medium to convey that design completely, because at the end of the day, this is what people and different stakeholders respond to. They respond less to detailed plans and that sort of stuff. So we're asking you to focus on these three things rather than other material that someone might not see later on.
And don't be afraid that if your idea, you don't think it actually kind of fits with what we're expecting. We don't have any expectation, and it's totally open. So we actually really want you to have fun and not feel that this is kind of like, oh god, this is not an enjoyable process at all. So yeah, okay. Just some ideas of how you might sort of plan your tile. We're not. Yeah, it doesn't have to be finitely detailed. Obviously, you've only got a week or 5 days even, so or even less now, 4 days.
And the idea is that we're aware of that time frame. So in order to throw you into the design phase of the process, the site information document has the analysis, and I've shared the Illustrator file that you can make a map like this very quickly from, and don't be afraid to pick up pen and paper and develop by hand as well.
We prefer you to use Slack only. Don't email us directly or anything like that. Mainly because that way, no matter who's in the office, we can check. Or majority of the time it'll be Leonore, because Sam and Britt are both quite busy. But not that Leonore's not busy either. But she knows all about the Rhino model and all the other files that essentially have gone into this. So yeah, is that it? Okay.
Great, thank you guys. That was a great introduction to Brisbane and the brief.
Sam said we're definitely going to go over an hour, and I was like, no.
I got sassed yesterday because I said I think we'll need more than an hour. Jake's like, wow.
2.
So I'm gonna, oh great. Okay, so we're all back here. Awesome, so thank you for that. And I just want to open it up to questions to the students. I do want to just make one statement as an opening. So the three systems, the flooding, the densification, and then the student system. So over the last couple of workshops, you guys have developed pretty coherent attitudes about kind of urban systems, or kind of coherent questions about how cities might perform. So like from the first week, we had the essential work that Rachel and Joe were working on, or tourism that Khalid and Jing were working on, or everyday adaptations from Rachel and Josiah. So, you know, that's just one example, but then we had a certain latitude to select other systems that might be important. So I'm more just saying you're open to return to a concept that you encountered in an earlier session, but we want you to be able to build on that so that you're not starting from zero. You're already starting from something that you've dedicated a week or two fleshing out some of the kind of finer points, or even the broad brush strokes of. So I hope that part makes sense. And with that, I'll kind of open it up to questions from the students or from Derek.
I do have a question.
Okay, Rachel, what's up?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was extremely informative. I haven't worked very closely with flooding before. I was curious because you guys mentioned how a lot of the projects all the projects that were chosen were based off of homes that were not like insured at all. And I was wondering how funding to get design services and this entire research and design initiative is coordinated, or who is involved in terms of funding.
When we started, it was all pro bono. So that's part of the thinking of the practice is we invest in ideas and not worry about the money too much. Like, we take on projects that we don't want to do in order to fund the ones that we do want to do. It's in the beginning, it's important, I think, to have freedom from funding a lot of the time, because then you're not owned by anybody. Your idea is, you can, and that's, to be honest, that's how we got Water Futures through, was, and we continue to do this by telling the people in power that we're not there to criticise them, we're not there to seek their endorsement, that we only are there to talk to them about ideas. And so when we started with the flood relief, everyone was just giving their time for free. They were going on weekends, helping, you know, we were coordinating. We had one guy fly up and come and moved up from Sydney just to help. And he gave his time for 6 weeks. You know, I think he was basically living on Social Security while he was working in the office, you know, because I couldn't afford to pay him. So that's sort of how we start. And then from there, once you start getting a name and being known for this, the money starts coming in, because the ideas have gone through kind of a critical phase of being tested. Whereas if you'll never get anybody to pay you for a good idea that is untested, generally. I mean, well, to be honest, that's not true. Architects generally rely on making mistakes and getting paid for it, right? So that's sort of but in terms of what we're doing, we've had to, yeah, I think it's important to have a period in the beginning of these things, which is all about the ideas.
And I think one of the key things, like with Water Futures, is when we brought everyone to work together, that built ownership over the ideas that we came in with, which actually meant that, for example, an insurance company helped us actually make the book. So there are ways that we built funding through just actually building relationships with people around the ideas that we started with.
Yeah.
I have a question actually about density. So you guys brought up this pretty amazing number that Rosalie has 25,000 people, but over some term will double in population to 50,000. And I wonder what the attitude is towards density of people and also towards density of building. We saw a lot of single-family houses on stilts, but I wonder what are the other alternatives that might be either currently happening or that people are comfortable with, or that might be fruitful sites for speculation.
To be honest, we're, as a city, trying to work that out. A lot of people love having a detached dwelling and love having their own backyard and are scared to give that up. But the reality is, over the next 30 years, the population of Rosalie will double, and the population of Brisbane will also get significantly dense. So yeah, we're in the process of trying to work out what a denser vernacular could be that encapsulates the ideas and space and quality of life that a detached, what we call a Queenslander house, could combine, could have it in a high density. Yeah,
it's a really interesting problem because we do density terribly in Australia. We're just suburbs basically, the whole country. And what we see happening is that the old industrial, similar to lots of parts of the United States, old industrial areas that are in floodplains are the ones that get turned into high density, which is part of the, I guess, problem that we're interested in here in Rosalie, is because there's a large section next to the river, which is where the 20-story buildings are going up. But at the bottom, they'll get flooded. So what does that mean?
Well, and the other problem with that, what's happening is the displacement of water due to mass.
Yeah.
So, the car parks have all got flood doors on them and things like that, or they're built up at a certain level, with, that's been the biggest problem, because we're going to keep flooding, obviously, and so the floodplain itself keeps expanding due to displacement of water, and also with more water coming out of the sky at certain times, our current what they work off 1 in 100-year kind of level is going to go up. I think it's by 2050, is that right? It becomes the current 1 in 200-year level, which is about 2 or 3 meters higher than it currently is now, will become the new 1 in 100-year level, which changes everything. It means that people who bought a property right now as a young couple, by the time they're in their 60s, they're going to be experiencing a very, very different city. And that's something that we see across the city a lot, especially in Rosalie, where there's a really old population of people who bought into that area 50 odd years ago. They've raised their families, they've now got grandkids. They don't owe anything on their homes. They don't want to move, because if they do move, they're going to be forced to live a long way away from hospitals and schools. And so it's an important thing to think about right now, is as a young family, if you were to buy into a certain area, what's it really going to be looking like by the time you really need support at an older age? It's quite an interesting problem that we're facing.
And two things to note from that. One, the extreme variety in the spread of the density, where you have whole lots with a house and one person living in it, compared to apartments bunched up in the lowest part that gets the worst flooding. But also keeping in mind, how do you help those people that are the vulnerable population, I guess, that's one person per house, and can't exactly manage the flood scenarios by themselves, and they become isolated from parts of the city when roads close down, so little islands of isolation.
And I guess one way that this area has become denser in the past few decades is this typology of Queenslanders are timber frame construction houses that are uplifted from the ground on stilts that were meant to be able to be moved, were able to be living with floods, so the water would go underneath them and your living space wouldn't be affected. People are building down underneath to capitalize, you know, on their properties, to densify the city with, you know, they have renters underneath their own homes. And that means there's a lot more concrete, that means there's a lot less space for water to flow. So not only are we dealing with climate change and worsening weather events, but we're also dealing with a city which has less capability to absorb water into the ground. Yes.
And thinking about what type of people live in those areas that are really at high risk, James and I had this joke about that house that we showed that was like 3 stories high. So we had this research exercise that we never did called Grandmas in Floodplains, because actually the grandma of the family lived on the ground floor, which was like, grandma would be under like 2 or 3 meters of water.
She can't walk upstairs. That's a fact. Yeah. In that house you showed me, which was really highly elevated next to the one we did, grandma still lives on the ground floor because she can't walk up on the stairs. Now I don't know whether that's actually delivered by the homeowner himself. It could be his mother-in-law that he's putting down there. You know, it's I think it's something to consider, like
access, right? Like think of disabled people as well. Like the higher you raise, the harder it is.
We also see a lot of students or young people renting in the ground floors of these raised Queenslanders, and a lot of the time they have no idea that they are in a floodplain or that their property is at risk, because the homeowners, their landlords don't tell them. Which is pretty scary.
The first time they might get an indication of that is when there's literally 3 feet of water coming through their bedroom.
Subtle. Are there any questions from the students?
Yeah, I have a question. So are the people who are coming to you and getting their houses improved or modified to be more resilient, are they using their own money? Are they using insurance money? Or is the government like providing aid? How are most people able to pay for this?
After the floods, some of the houses, it's a range of those things. The first one we did that we showed you, their insurers didn't pay at all, even though they were insured. So they had to extend their mortgage, which was difficult anyway because the property values had dropped by about 20 to 30%. So a lot of the time people just go into further debt. Now some did have insurance, but again the insurers will try their best to limit the amount of money they're paying out by coming up with reasons to justify a lower payment. So our thinking is better to get the house working well, or the property working well in the beginning, and then when the event does occur, it's going to be less troublesome on the family essentially. So yeah, it's a range of different things. But typically, most people end up in further debt, basically.
But through our work through the last 10 years or so, that project that James mentioned at the end, the Flood Resilient Homes project, that is a project funded by the city. So
yeah, so we have. So basically how that came about is that they took the bottom 10 suburbs, the worst 10 suburbs in the city. They then looked at how much money it would cost to put in pipes to drain that and how long that would take. It came to a figure of something like $600 million, I think, or more. And it was going to take them 20 to 30 years of capital works program to actually put in drainage, which then they couldn't actually guarantee was going to work anyway. So they turned around and said, okay, well, we'll give you, to begin with, we'll give you $12 million to essentially go to those areas, to the worst affected areas, and you can have $50,000 per house, to work up a maximum of 50,000 per house. If there are houses that you think should be raised, we'll give you $100,000. Because they worked out by giving us this $12 million, we were saving a serious amount of money. Like some areas where they would be having to spend $40 million just to put in pipes for 8 houses. You know, it was ridiculous. And so by funding resilience works, it's a practical solution for people, but it also saving the city a lot of money. And they're getting an immediate outcome really within a year or two. We're in and out, and people are incredibly happy and actually quite thankful because they live with flooding a lot of the time. And so they're well and truly aware. And so it's the practical nature of, but also has a serious kind of social kind of context to it as well. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point.
One of the things that I think is so awesome about the work in the book that you guys shared with us is how direct some of the solutions are. Like the vegetation around the perimeter of property is sort of just a filter to collect some of the stuff before it gets onto your property, or to think about vegetation as a collective asset. I think those are really, really powerful solutions that show how design can provide value without creating excessive cost, like building a pipe for every single problem, but to say, what do we have at hand, and how might we deploy that? So I think those kinds of solutions seem really exciting to me. I have a kind of, oh, go ahead.
Oh, so I was going to say, like, as I mentioned, we've done a lot of work in Aboriginal communities and with a lot of Aboriginal people who nature comes first, right? So to have an urban design kind of future urban design program or process, like the Dutch have been doing for 1,000 years, we have to start with nature, and we all know this. This is why we're here with you guys, because you have a similar concern and interest. And I think that start with nature first. It doesn't mean that it has to, you can't kind of manipulate nature, obviously, because the Dutch have manipulated nature for 1,000 years and got it to work for them. We see Aboriginal people manipulating nature. They're not passive participants in nature. They are active participants in nature. And that's, whereas when we ignore nature, that's when we get into trouble. And so I think, one of the kind of key things about all of this is begin with it, understand it. It's only through understanding it that you can then manipulate it, but always respect it. Like it's something that's important. So.
And this lecture is uploaded, or will be after we finish, and so we actually skipped through quite a number of those tools as well. So you guys can have a look at that in a little bit more detail about landscape, but also things to do with buildings,
what materials to use,
materials, etc.
I think
I have a. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. The Flood Resilient Homes program, it is sort of a band-aid solution in a way as well. It's a way that we've allowed water to flow through homes without trying to fight nature by keeping it out. But the way that we are now looking at Rosalie is, how do we develop in this area without disturbing the floodplain too much? How do we build smart? How do we increase the density in the area, but without putting people at risk? And so that's, I guess, the task that we've started to provide a framework for, but are also asking you guys to carry through in your design response.
Like, we believe in retreating from areas too, obviously, right? So that's something that I want to make very clear. It's not the overarching kind of idea, but retreat when you have to. Sometimes you just have to go.
But with the caveat of, if you think people should move, you should be actually finding the solution of where they move to and maintain their community.
Yeah. So retain them in their local context.
Yeah.
Don't just move old ladies out to the suburbs somewhere a long way away, where they're, it's the whole point of community is as, and even now also with isolation. I'm hoping that once this vaccine's sorted, then everyone will go let's sort this community thing out a lot better because we've all been so isolated. We're lucky now, we can sit here within, you know, a foot of each other kind of thing. But, you know,
yeah, it's an unusual sight from our end of the world over here to see 4 coworkers in the same room. I have a question that kind of comes back to something that Josiah was bringing up in his point, but it has to do with ownership and what you were talking about. You know, the young families coming to buy a parcel of land or a house in this neighborhood. They face a lot of uncertainty about the future, and I wonder if there are models for collective ownership or groups coming together like they might do in Germany with the Baugruppen, where 5 or 10 families will come together and share resources to either buy a parcel or build collectively. And maybe a kind of similar type of questions. I wonder about air rights, which maybe is a more dense kind of question, but you know, I guess you brought it up with the grannies on the ground, but like, who owns the space below the building and who potentially owns the space above?
yeah, so there are, it's interesting, we were involved in for a couple of years, an organisation called Nightingale, which is about collective sort of medium density housing. It's run by an architect in Melbourne. It's primarily inhabited by architects a lot of the time. So it doesn't sort of, because it's known as being a designer kind of sustainability sort of thing, but there are models like that. From what I know from experience, and I've visited a couple of the ones in Germany actually, in Berlin, and I think personally, the Europeans are much more socially focused on working together as a community than, say, Americans or Australians. You know, the yearning for individual freedom and kind of our own little sort of fiefdom affects that. Whereas, you know, I've experienced in Spain, like Spain has, we always talk about Germany, mainly because I think it's more well known, but Spain's had like 50, 60 years of collective building where, you know, a group of doctors, for instance, will get together and build a 10-story building and for all their families, and that's sort of 50 years ago, and they're all still there. And, you know, so I think there's models definitely around the world that work. It's just culturally, whether that actually, like whether it's a utopian ideal. I know that they're working hard on a Baugruppen in Sydney at the moment, and I hope it works. We did struggle to get it to work here in Brisbane.
I think the switch in thinking is like in Australia and in the States, housing is also an asset, right? It's actually it's about money, whereas the idea of housing as a home is kind of messed up with that. And I think that's a really difficult thing to get away from when the system's already set up that way.
Yeah, and I think it's probably to do with the history of, say, Europe being overpopulated a lot sooner than, say, the US or Australia, where we've had so much land to be able to continue to divide up that it's affected our psyche, where realistically, if we don't want to live next door to somebody, we just go and cut another block up somewhere else out on the outskirts of the city. So it's kind of like this weird thing where you kind of trying to encourage people to live in denser environments, because we know that hopefully it's a better option for us. We don't just keep destroying the world. But in countries that are as big as the US and Australia, it's a hard sell. Whereas in Europe, you know, they were under population pressures from way back. So they had to learn to live together. And so perhaps yeah, it's a really difficult one, I think, for our future, because we have to sell the dream somehow, and you know, it's anyway.
Yeah, it's an important task as us as architects as well, that we can help show people who don't want to live detached dwellings that living in denser buildings doesn't have to be a sacrifice, that it can be a really great thing with a lot of benefits as well.
Yeah. But we'll help this week to sort that out, just in 1 week.
All it takes is a week. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Are there any other questions from the students before we jump into the workshop itself? Everybody's pretty clear. Okay. I'm gonna recording.